I'm Catherine Buxton, and since discovering the joy of meditation in my late 30s, I've been on a journey of self-discovery that has introduced me to some fascinating ideas. Join me as I take a deeper dive into the areas of our well-being that we just don't give enough attention to. Would our lives really be any better if we took our well-being seriously? Each week I'll be joined by a well-being specialist to unpick the value of sleep, nutrition, kindness and so much more. This is Things You Should Care About podcast in association with Isbourne.org. So this is Things You Should Care About podcast with me, Catherine Buxton, in association with Isbourne.org. And I am joined today by the very lovely Sue Rabbich. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you.
So Sue, tell us a little bit about yourself, because just to let the listeners know that you're actually very much involved with death, which doesn't sound a particularly jolly subject, but I'm really intrigued to hear a bit more about your association with everything to do with dying, would you believe?
Yes. So I've had a professional career, but I've been for quite a long time a reflexologist and a healer. And in fact, I used to run the healing group at the Isbourne for a few years, a long time ago. And then I had an opportunity to do some volunteering in recent years. And I'd heard about a group called Soul Midwives, they're basically end-of-life companions. And I was bought a book, and I just clocked it. I put it to one side and I said, I'm going to do that one day. And then that one day came a bit sooner than I'd imagined, and I had the opportunity to do some training. But I also was living in London on a short-term basis and had an opportunity to volunteer at some of the big London hospitals on the wards. So although I was a reflexologist, I was actually spending a lot of time talking to people, and a cancer centre as well, talking about them dying and the issues which were coming up for them. And I was enormously privileged to have some amazing conversations, which I'd like to think helped people. And even in 20 or 30 minutes with them, it was amazing the sorts of things we were talking about, and a lot of that came through the power of touch, just a gentle hand or a foot massage, and people would start opening up. So yes, I've been very, very, very privileged. And the reason I ended up on this journey, if you like, is because the first person I experienced dying, probably the case for quite a lot of people, was one of their parents, my mother, quite a few years ago now. And I experienced something, even as a healer, which I wasn't quite expecting. And that was my mother's final gift to me, was setting me off on this journey of being a soul midwife. And yes, I'm enormously thankful. And that whole framing that her passing in the way of thinking about final gifts, I have found a really helpful way of looking at things. And that ultimately came from a book called Final Gifts, which was written by two hospice nurses, and I can't remember their names, but it was essentially about what people need to die peacefully. And that whole business about sort of framing what that person has meant to you in those terms, I have found enormously helpful. So it just set me off on a journey.
So why do you think people would choose a soul midwife for their end of their life? What are the sort of reasons behind it, do you think?
Well, I think some people do it, but don't necessarily say, they maybe don't actually know about soul midwives, but sometimes it can be a very good friend, can't it? Although sometimes having somebody that's well without the family, or who's much more of an independent advocate, can be quite helpful. But I think it's something that naturally builds up over time. I mean, and a soul midwife can be with somebody from the point of diagnosis, as in cancer, which could be years before they actually die. And it's just providing that emotional, practical and spiritual support for them and their family. I think more people could do with knowing that we exist. Yeah. I think we've got a a long way to go, and particularly in these times, sort of saying, you know, we're out there to help you. Yes, I'm not sure I've answered that question very well, actually.
No, I think you're right. I think when you have a prognosis, and you know that the end of the life is going to be, your end of your life is going to be, you know, fairly soon or somewhere down the line, you have a kind of definitive idea about when you're going to die. The first thing you think about and worry about is, you know, your family, about having to help and support them going through it. So I think you're right. I think having somebody that's completely outside of the family and more objective can be just such a relief, to have somebody there that you can,
yes,
like, do the practical things, but also talk to.
Yeah. I mean, I have got some really good examples of that, if you'd like to hear any. But I do know that because people worry so much about talking about this kind of thing with their family, even though they want to because they might upset them, they often don't, which is, you know, a huge shame. So there was one lady who had probably been about my age in a hospital in London, and she was dying of pancreatic cancer. And she'd actually been, in her mind, she thought she had about 18 months. But actually, not that I know a huge amount about cancer, but my feeling was, from what I've heard previously, that wasn't likely to be that long. But the thing was, all the treatment that she was having, she had a really bad reaction to. So most of the time, she would say 6 days out of 7, she was feeling absolutely dreadful. And she was back in hospital again. And she was saying, you know, I haven't got long to go. I don't want to be spending the time that I do have left feeling so awful that I can't spend time with my daughters and my grandchildren. And I've got things I want to sort out. So one of the conversations was about, well, is it worth talking to your consultant? Because actually I'd seen a really interesting interview by a palliative care consultant at another London hospital, who was basically saying, you know, for us, the emphasis should, or in hospice, the emphasis, and that's my understanding of the difference between a palliative care ward in a hospital and maybe a hospice, is the emphasis is a bit different. It's more about, in hospice, making the most of the time that you've got left, rather than constantly trying to treat you, even though it's making no difference. In simple language, that's my understanding.
Yes, I think you're right.
So I said, do you think it's time to have a conversation then with your consultant along those lines, to say, well, this treatment you're giving me, it's making me feel even worse. I don't think it's going to prolong my life much. You know, is it time we kind of stop that? So that was one conversation. Another conversation I had with her was that the other daughter didn't come at all. She corresponded with her by phone, but she never visited in hospital because she was getting married the next year. And she didn't want to accept that her mother might not be there. So she kept saying to her mother, I'm ringing her saying, oh, I booked you a facial appointment, and I booked your hair appointment, and this, and this. And she said to me, what do I do? You know, I need her to really face this because I don't think I've got long left. So I suggested maybe she should write her a letter, which she did, apparently, which worked really well. And then that sort of got them together and sort of life moved on. So that was really helpful. And then the final conversation I had with her before she died was she didn't know whether she should, or whether the children should come to her funeral. So I said, well, obviously it's not for me to tell you one way or the other, but I can think of quite a few advantages if they want to come, and maybe asking them is the thing that you need to do. But one is you hear some amazing stuff about people that you never knew. You also learn how much other people loved your mother, granny, whatever, and how comforting that is. And it's a really important part of the grieving process. So I said, those are the things that kind of spring to mind. So weigh that up against, well, they're going to be upset anyway. So, you know, coming to the funeral might be more beneficial than you might imagine. I said, but I think maybe ask the children, because I think children are much wiser and more on the ball about what's going on than we might give them credit for. But a lot of people really struggle with starting those important conversations with their own family.
So that's where I can see how having a soul midwife along with you helps you to be able to have, you know, to start those conversations, or to find ways to start those conversations.
Yes, and we have quite a lot of tools, if you like, in our toolbox.
Right, great stuff. So you train. There's a training program that you go through.
There is.
Yeah.
There's an introductory day course, and I knew straight away I was in the right place and this is what I was going to do. And it felt like after all these years of doing my, developing myself, doing my complementary therapy, this was absolutely where I needed and wanted to be. And I still feel that, and I absolutely love it.
That's great. Is it always terribly sad?
No, absolutely not. No, I mean, there are sad times, and sometimes I've come home from the hospital and said, oh, that poor lady today, or that her poor husband, or whatever. But I just feel that I can make such a difference to people in such a short time. And I know it sounds a bit of a cliche, but it is an enormous privilege. And I have learnt to have great faith in humanity in a way. And the fact that a lot of these people in really desperate circumstances, okay, dying is one thing, but all the things that have led up to that, or the circumstances surrounding all of that, for whatever reason, are even more sad. And generally people have been pleasant and often jovial and really just amazing. And I just wonder, in such circumstances, how on earth would I be?
Yes, I suppose in a way what you witness is the best in humanity, which is lovely, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and most people are very fearful, and you can do and say certain things, and the discussions help to allay those fears, which is about the best you can do. Often you're not there as a fixer, but if you can, that opportunity. And I've learnt to plan more for my own death as a result. And the best way I feel I can prepare my family, especially my children, for my death, is to talk about it and to say, I've said to them already, apart from the fact I've already now got my sort of funeral plan in place, I've also got a little a sheet for my final wishes. So it's not about what happens after you die, but if you have the choice about where you are, who you're with, what your room is like, whether you're inside, outside, those kinds of details, which can make such a difference to having a peaceful death and the best death you can have. Those are the things I've filled in and I've talked about with them. And I think I hope that at some point in the future that they will be grateful that we've had those conversations, and that whole subject, is more the norm now. And they always, people sort of think I'm obsessed about death, but I just love talking about it. I love understanding people's views on it, and I've learned a lot about myself.
But not only do you work with individuals as a soul midwife, but you also run something called a death cafe, is that right?
Yes, that's right. So the first introductory day I did on the training, before you do your level 1 or your level 2 if you wish, I heard about this thing called a death cafe, and I just stopped and my jaw just fell open, and I said, what on earth is that? So basically, it's an international movement started by a British guy who was facing death not many years ago now. And you can find your nearest death cafe, well, anywhere in the world, well, the Western world anyway, probably. So there are lots on in the States and New Zealand, Australia, wherever, online. And so I thought, well, I better go along to one and find out how they work. And this happened to be one in Finsbury Park, in a cafe in Finsbury Park. And essentially, there are certain rules. If you wish to hold a death cafe as per the death cafe movement, there are certain rules if you look on site. And one of them is you don't set any kind of agenda, because it's not about promoting any services or direction or beliefs or anything. But there were 30 or 40 people there, so we were split up into groups. And then there was 1 or 2 starter questions, just to kind of, if people didn't know quite where to start, although most people did. And one of the ones that I like the best, that I use for my death cafes, is 5 things. Write down 5 things about how you'd like to be remembered. And that gets people going in a very positive way, usually, about how their life has gone, what they feel they've given to life. I mean, sometimes it can be enormously sad. And I think the people that fear death most are the ones that haven't lived their life.
Yeah.
So a death cafe, certain things. So on my poster, for example, I have certain things which say, my strapline is breaking the taboo on talking about death and dying. And the funny thing is, when I set this cafe up, I went to a couple of cafes in Bishop's Cleeve, actually near Cheltenham, and it so happened that the new couple had just taken over one of the cafes. And when I said, you might think this is a bit weird, but this is what I do, and I'm thinking of doing this locally, what do you think? She said, oh, that's absolutely fine. My husband is a funeral director. So I'd obviously gone to the right place, but it wasn't because, you know, I made it clear there was no opportunity for him to advertise his services or anything. But, you know, they were understanding of the whole issue and, you know, the need to talk about it and so forth. So they're always offered on a not-for-profit basis, although the idea of supporting the cafe through buying drinks and cake is good. It's a respectful and confidential space. And there's no intention at all of leading participants towards any particular conclusion or product or, yeah.
So it's just basically an opportunity just to talk.
It is. And we've had some laughs. Some of the things that have come up have been so amusing. Yes, it's been fascinating.
Can you give me an example of something?
So there was one lady who was American actually, and she was staying locally for several months, and she was just saying, well, I've decided that I'm going to donate my body to medical science. So I said, oh, that's very interesting. Why is that? She said, well, it basically means you don't have to pay for a funeral, and no one else has to pay for a funeral.
You think we find it so difficult to talk about death?
I think it's partly the British culture compared to other cultures, certainly. And I recall when my grandmother died, and even when I was very small at the time, but my younger sister died, and I never ever heard my parents talk about that.
No.
After that, you never saw anything or got any sense of how they must have felt after that for so many years, and until very much later in life. I think it's just one of those things. It was just the stiff upper lip, and you don't talk about those things, which a lot of the things people were saying in the death cafe, that one at Finsbury Park, was there were several people in my group of about 8 of us who said they had death anxiety, and they related it to the fact that for those sorts of reasons, you know, families not wishing to talk about stuff that they've wanted to talk about, and that's what they felt.
Yeah.
So,
is it you think we find it so difficult to talk about death?
I think it's partly the British culture compared to other cultures, certainly. And I recall when my grandmother died, and even when I was very small at the time, but my younger sister died, and I never ever heard my parents talk about that.
No.
After that, you never saw anything or got any sense of how they must have felt after that for so many years, and until very much later in life. I think it's just one of those things. It was just the stiff upper lip, and you don't talk about those things, which a lot of the things people were saying in the death cafe, that one at Finsbury Park, was there were several people in my group of about 8 of us who said they had death anxiety, and they related it to the fact that for those sorts of reasons, you know, families not wishing to talk about stuff that they've wanted to talk about, and that's what they felt.
Yeah.
So
it's very different also, I think, culturally from the East and the West, actually. I think the Eastern traditions have a much more healthier kind of perspective on death.
Yes,
yeah.
I'm absolutely sure you're right.
Yeah, it feels healthier in lots of ways, rather than our kind of, like you say, stiff upper lip. Let's pretend it's not happened and just get on with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do strangers, when you go to a death cafe, it's strangers talking to other strangers about death. Yeah. Do they find that difficult? Is it easy to break the ice, or, you know?
Well, personally, I found it pretty easy. We do have a few tools up our sleeve, and there is something that you can buy called Grave Talk cards, where you've just got those questions kind of just to get you going if necessary. But everybody that comes, and it's usually only just a small group that I've done previously, but everybody has got something to say about death or something you know that's died or whatever. And I think once people are reassured, it's a confidential, supportive space, and a lot does depend, I think, on the cafe host, setting the right tone and, if you like. But no, I've not had any problems, and I've not really had any problems online either, which is a slightly more, you could be a slightly more difficult scenario to manage.
And what's the kind of makeup of the people that go there?
It's been a mixture up to now. Certainly, I did run one at the Cancer Centre in London, and one of the things one lady was saying, she was facing death. She had a terminal illness, but wasn't literally expecting to die sort of the next day or anything. One of the things she said was that she really hated it when people said to her, "Oh, stay positive," that kind of stuff. She said, if I feel, am I allowed to use the word crap one day, that should be allowed. And having somebody say that to me is one of the worst things they can say. It's to drive her insane. So, a mixture. There was one lady that came from, she came from the local coroner's office, actually, because she wanted to understand more about how she could support people. But I think we're probably going to come on to this, aren't we? Talking about what's the difference between talking about death and dying and bereavement counselling.
Yeah, I was going to say, how does the Death Cafe movement, how does it differ from bereavement counselling?
Well, in my view, bereavement counselling, I think people would perhaps be expecting more a trained counsellor. Although a lot of church groups offer bereavement support groups, so they're not necessarily trained counsellors. But I think a lot of the skills are the same, and I think a lot moves over from one side to the other, because if you're talking about your own death and how you might see it or plan it, much like we go to a lot of trouble to plan a birth, don't we?
Absolutely, yeah.
And if you think about all the resources and the time that goes into thinking about that, well, we should really be doing the same for us dying. So I'm struggling to understand what the question was now. Oh, the difference between bereavement and death at cafes. So yes, so I mean, there is a lot of overlap, because inevitably talking about your own death, you then start talking about other people that that have died or whatever, and some of that will be about bereavement and grief. So I think if you're running a bereavement a cafe like I was for the Isbourne a while back, I think I was clear to make it obvious that I wasn't a trained counsellor, and it was about using my active listening skills and just providing that supportive space.
Yeah, I can see that. So there is a little bit of crossover there, but there is a difference, isn't there?
There is a difference. There is a difference in how you manage people to deal with their grief. And I came across a fantastic poem a while back about grief, which I found enormously helpful, and I passed that on to quite a few people, actually. Yeah.
So I guess it's like using a whole range of different skills, isn't it?
It is.
The person. Yeah.
Yes, active listening is the absolute key, and I'd like to think I'm getting better at that, but it does take a lot of practice and allowing for those pauses, particularly online as well. I think it is really, really important.
Is there a kind of a religious aspect to the Death Cafe?
No, we in our Death Cafe or as soul midwives, we're definitely non-denominational in our practice, but there's certainly to all of that a spiritual element, and some of us work more, if you like, at that level than others. some of us are much more on the practical support side, but some people are very much on the spiritual side. Yes, rather religious. And in fact, some of the soul midwives group are sort of on the chaplain's team or the chaplaincy team at you know, a hospital or a hospice or something. So yeah, so no, we accept all religions and faiths and beliefs really, and it's not for us to say otherwise.
And do you find that the topic of spirituality or religion comes up a lot in your soul midwife work and the chat in the Death Cafe?
Sometimes, although it's quite a tricky one, isn't it? People are very frightened, particularly in I would say in the UK. In my experience, they're quite frightened of that word spiritual, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah.
I think so. Even though I'm a spiritual healer, I don't necessarily use that term very often. In fact, most of the time, I don't tell people I'm a healer at all.
No, no.
Most people seem to accept Reiki, I think, and Reiki, even the word Reiki healing seems to be perhaps more acceptable than spiritual healing.
Mm.
So yeah, you have to tread quite carefully, really.
Mm. Yeah. And what kinds of things do come up around spirituality? Is it just, you know, is it the kind of thing, you know, what's going to happen to me? Am I going to another place, or, you know, or is it just a kind of a bigger picture or a bigger kind of reflection on their life in general? I
think all of that, certainly, in that, and sort of facing death does make you really think about those things a lot more. And I've read some very interesting books. I mean, some people firmly believe that there's nothing else afterwards, and some people think that. But during our Soul Midwives course, we learn about the stages of dying, because if we can understand, they're quite clearly differentiated, and we learn what might work to help people at those different stages. The third stage, where it's called the fire stage, where people get very, and you may have experience of this, people get very agitated, they get very irritable, they might be plucking at the bed sheets, they might be looking up into the corner of a room, they might be talking to somebody that's supposedly not there, etc. And I have quite a lot of people say to me, and my aunt was one of these when my uncle died. She said, oh, he was just hallucinating. And I say, I'm not necessarily sure that's the case. I think my view is that the veil between this life and the next is very thin at that point. And I was pretty sure my uncle could see my mother waiting for him, etc. And I would never dismiss what people say. So that's an example, I think, where the spiritual element is kind of coming in, and accepting what people are saying is so important, you know, because they're still conscious at that point. And even when they're not conscious, we learn to still stay with the person, hold the space, don't feel that it's wasted time. And even after they've died, there's, you know, a period, and it's certainly true for some religions, isn't it? Like Muslims, mothers, that, or not Muslims maybe, because they have to bury the body quickly, but there's some where you're supposed to leave the body and not move it for 3 days. And that's about the spirit leaving. That kind of thing is really important to some faiths. So yes, things do come up, and it is really interesting. Really
do you when you're a soul midwife, do you do a lot with the family after the death?
Well, I haven't had much of that experience so far, but in hospitals it was quite interesting, because you may be, you know, you'd be sent into somebody's room that maybe you've never met before, and most of the family are there. This person really is pretty close to the end, and yet they're all vying with each other to give the best care. So some people are trying to stuff food into this person's mouth, and arguing about stuff over them. And you know, if it had been a private scenario where somebody had taken me on to be the soul midwife, I might have felt more in a position to say, actually, I think it's time now not to bother with the food scenario, and maybe having a bit more peace around the bedside would be helpful, but when you're in a hospital setting and you're not really in charge, it's difficult to be sort of assertive in that way, or to be the advocate for the person, and you don't necessarily know them very well, and sometimes not at all if you've not met them before. But if I can give just one example that stuck with me, and particularly from this book Final Gifts, about the spirituality side.
Yeah, sure.
And talking about that veil being very thin between this life and the next. A young colleague of mine first suggested the book to me. Her mother was dying of cancer at quite an early age, and she read this book, and she had learnt from the book that yes, you mustn't rubbish what people are saying, and that you must try and understand the language, what they're trying to tell you. So her mother, she went into the hospital one day, and her mother said she'd had a dream the night before. And so Becky said, "Oh, tell me about the dream." And her mother said, "I was building a bridge, and on the other side of the stream was her mother, Becky's grandmother." And so Becky instantly said, "Is the bridge finished?" And her mother said no, so that she knew that she wasn't quite ready to go. Now, it's a simple thing and it sounds so obvious, but that was really powerful for me in terms of just understanding what people are trying to tell you at some level often, and just trying to understand their language. And that feels very much the spiritual side of what we do.
Yes, people understanding they're coming to the end, and their subconscious through their dreams. Yes, allowing them to experience that or to feel that. What's the one thing that you've come away with, or maybe there's more than one thing that's come away with from your experience of being a soul midwife and running the death cafes?
I think it is about preparing people, about preparing your family, about talking about these things and writing stuff down. And I say I've got my final wishes and that sort of thing. I think that's really important. But on a lighter note, from the death cafes, the thing that I usually start off both death cafes when, if it makes people laugh, is this lovely American lady. One of the other things she said was, if you only knew you only had sort of 3 or 6 months to live, what would you do first? And she said, "I would cancel all my expensive dental appointments."
It's been fascinating, Sue. Thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us. Now, we have one last question I want to ask you, which we ask all of our guest speakers, and that is, what one piece of advice has someone given you that you'd like to pass on to somebody else?
Well, I think it's probably the latter, or words to that effect. Absolutely. Yeah. But also contemplating your death and planning for a good death helps to make you live life well. And every day I remind myself to do that.
That's fantastic, Sue. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Sue, if people want to get in touch with you or are interested in talking about death cafes or having you as a soul midwife, how do they get in touch with you?
They're welcome to ring me or to email me.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So you've got an email address, Sue?
Yes, so it's sue.rabbich, RABBICH, @gmail.com.
Lovely. Okay, yeah. Chat with you then. Are you running a death cafe in the near future?
I'm hoping to do some more from the Isbourne. We haven't discussed any dates yet. If people want to Google Soul Midwives as well, we've got a wonderful website with lots of training, most of it online, and groups, and a really nice sort of it's called Being Alongside Facebook book group and things. So there's lots of stuff going on.
Well, thanks ever so much for joining us this morning.